finally, and not the least, we have Melissa Conley Tyler. Melissa, a good friend of IDSR, and I think I'm saying this for the third time, so I don't need to say it again. Melissa, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. 大家好，很高兴认识你们。I'm really delighted to be involved today in the Taipei对话. As CEO Lynn has said, I was lucky enough to be a visiting fellow at IDSR during this year. But as things happen, I just arrived and got out of quarantine, and Taipei went into lockdown. And so I was so grateful to all my colleagues that they supported me, they enabled me to do my research, which was looking at US-Taiwan relations under the Biden administration. And I had a fabulous time despite the lockdown. So I'm always happy to support, and it's a pleasure to be here today. One thing I did take out of my time in Taiwan is that Taiwan faces both acute and unique security challenges. So the last thing I would want to do is try to tell Taiwan what it should be doing. But what I can do is I can talk a little bit about a case study of what we're doing in Australia at the moment. I'm now at an organisation called the Asia Pacific Development, Diplomacy and Defence Dialogue. And I can talk about what we're doing with our communications within government and within the development, diplomacy and defence communities to try to achieve a more whole-of-government approach. Now, the impetus for this is interesting in itself. This initiative came out of various organisations in Australian foreign policy having a sort of simultaneous belief that there was a problem with the way that our different communities talk together. And I can just give an example from my own experience. Australia was involved in RAMSI, the Regional Assistance Mission for the Solomon Islands, for more than a decade. At the start of that deployment, I remember when I was at the Australian Institute of International Affairs as director there, we pulled together an excellent panel looking at smart power. We had Joseph Nye come and join it. It was hosted by the Secretary of Foreign Affairs, who later went on to be the Secretary of Defence. And it was all great about how we should be joined up using all of the elements of our national power. We had all of the relevant people in the room. And what became really clear to me within a few minutes is that they didn't talk to each other. The people in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet didn't talk to the people in Foreign Affairs or Defence or the international broadcasters or our aid agency, and they were going out into the field without those ongoing habits of communication between them. And I think there's a lot more we can do. So fast forward to where we are now. Some organisations, particularly in the aid industry, the Australian Council for International Development and International Development Contractors Community, from the defence community, the Institute for Regional Security, and from the diplomacy side, the Australian National University, came together and said we need to come up with something, some sort of body that helps us coordinate across the three communities better. And wonderfully, got support. So I've been hired because we've got a year's funding from the Australian Civil Military Centre, so that's a part of our Department of Defence, to look at how we can bring together people from those three communities to improve Australia's influence in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Okay. And so in that sense, we're all about external influence. How do we strategically communicate and build up our influence in two of the most important regions for Australia? But the way we're doing it is the communication within, getting those three communities to actually talk together. So what we've done is we've been having sessions with non-government people in defence, diplomacy and development, looking at what are the key issues for Australia in Southeast Asia, which we're looking at first. What are some of the priority areas we should work on? Where is it that defence, diplomacy and development perspectives can come together and have the most impact? And what will come out of that is ideas, a suite of options and ideas for government about what government as a whole can do to try to increase our influence in those regions. Now, in doing this, we're obviously very much drawing off international examples. So, very conscious of, the US 3D approach, which, has been around since at least Secretary of State Clinton. And, a lot of, I think, very, very strong support from US defence establishment. Looking at what the UK has done with its integrated review, which brings together development, defence and diplomacy in one strategic document. But then, of course, for a country Australia's size, we're also very interested in looking at what Canada's done and what the Netherlands has been doing. And there's some really interesting examples of trying to bring together this more integrated 3D approach. I suppose the thing we're trying to add is this fourth D of dialogue, of explicitly making sure that there are channels of communication across the three communities, which won't happen naturally. Naturally, they will be siloed because they have been created to be siloed in different organisations. And you have to work very hard if you're going to try to break down those silos. What we've seen from the international examples is that if you want this dialogue to work, if you want communication across government, a whole of government approach, you need that dialogue element, that respect, that there is, interest in, respect for the other communities, and that's something you build up through communication. Now, in terms of making this case to government and to people outside of government, there's a very clear argument for development and diplomacy communities. They tend to feel quite sidelined, at least in Australia. I'd say, a hard security approach is probably the more dominant at the moment. And so for them, this is a way of trying to get more, more communication, more respect for what they bring, how important they are as national tools of statecraft. But I think there's an argument for defence, which is very strong as well. It can be about not wanting defence to be asked to carry everything, that every problem is a defence problem. It's about having the other elements of statecraft properly resourced to do their jobs, because otherwise it's going to end up on defence's plate. And, sensible people from a defence will tell you, well, there is only one thing that our military is optimised to do, and that's lethal force. Anytime you're getting it to do other things, that's actually not the most efficient approach. I think there's also a sense that, greater coordination gives us more tools. If you're talking about a stabilisation, a post-conflict operation, understanding that you have many tools at your disposal gives you more ability to impact on that situation. And I think there's a sense that not just working together in crisis, but actually planning together, bringing defence, diplomacy and development perspectives together at the start of your planning actually gets you better thinking, because every one of those communities has strengths but also blind spots, things that they don't think enough about, and putting them together helps you see those blind spots a bit more clearly and move through them. So as I say, Taiwan's situation is obviously very different than Australia's. Strategic circumstances are different. I think diplomacy has a stronger role in Taiwan's international engagement than it perhaps has right at the moment in Australia. I feel that, from what I've seen, it has an important place in the thinking about how to engage in the world. And, you have diplomats who are some of the most sort of creative and engaged that I've ever seen, because it's so much tougher to do diplomacy if you're Taiwan. They work so much harder than the people I've seen elsewhere. And I think, of course, development has a different history in Taiwan. I think it's only, more recently looks a bit more like Australia's development program. So there are differences. There's no question about that. But what I hope is just from this discussion, people listening might be able to take something away, looking at an Australian case study of a whole of government approach, getting defence, working with other agencies in a communicative whole of government way. Thanks again.